In the heart of a lively London neighborhood, a respected teacher, adored by her community for her seemingly perfect life, hides a dark secret. Her manipulative affair with her father-in-law triggers a series of events that lead to murder. This is the story of Emily Peterson, a woman whose obsession with control and independence spirals into a deadly tragedy that shocks everyone around her. Emily Peterson, 36, seemed to live a life many envied. She had the image of a dedicated teacher, actively involved in every school and community event. People often admired her devotion to her family, especially to her husband Thomas, who worked tirelessly managing his chain of flower shops. While Thomas focused on expanding the business, Emily stayed at home, raising their children Lily and Max, instilling values of responsibility and kindness in them. During this time, George Williams, Thomas's father, now 65, had retired from the business to enjoy his free time. Once a successful businessman, George was known for his wisdom and insights, frequently attending local events and offering advice to younger generations in the area. After losing his wife, George became more reclusive, though he still maintained a strong presence in the community. Emily admired George from afar, viewing him as a source of strength and stability. However, by 2010, her marriage to Thomas had grown distant. Thomas's focus on the flower shops consumed all his energy. He left early in the morning and returned late at night, always exhausted. Their conversations had dwindled to brief exchanges about bills and the children. The warmth they once shared had faded, leaving Emily feeling isolated, unappreciated, and emotionally neglected. In those lonely moments, Emily turned to George. At first, their interactions were innocent, casual chats after neighborhood events or quick conversations at family gatherings, but gradually their discussions grew deeper. By early 2011, Emily and George had become closer. With Thomas constantly busy, George frequently visited the house, filling in roles Thomas couldn't. Emily appreciated how George always made time for her. Unlike her husband, George listened to her frustrations, sympathized with her struggles, and offered comforting words. George, still grieving his late wife, found solace in Emily's company. He had never fully recovered from his wife's passing in 2009, and though he remained composed, the pain lingered. He saw in Emily a kindred spirit, someone suffering in silence as he was. Their conversations often revolved around their personal difficulties, with George confiding in Emily about how empty his house felt since his wife passed away. Emily, in return, shared how abandoned she felt in her marriage, explaining how Thomas no longer noticed or appreciated her. This shared vulnerability forged a deep emotional bond between them. By mid-2011, George began visiting more often, offering to help around the house or spend time with the children. But both of them knew something was changing. The lines between father-in-law and daughter-in-law blurred. Emily, who had always been seen as a devoted wife, began to enjoy the power she had over George. She could see the effect she had on him, how his demeanor softened whenever they were alone. Gradually, Emily began to manipulate the situation, carefully playing into George's emotions while keeping up her image as the devoted daughter-in-law. She would talk about how much she missed having a partner who truly cared for her, knowing that George, in his vulnerability, would fall into that role. She frequently brought up topics of loss and loneliness, aware that George's emotional fragility would keep him conflicted. By the end of 2011, their relationship had crossed from emotional to physical, though it remained hidden beneath layers of secrecy and guilt. George, torn between his grief and his deepening attachment to Emily, wrestled with the affair. Emily, on the other hand, faced no such struggle. For her, the affair was all about control. She relished the power she wielded over George, a man once considered untouchable in the community. It wasn't love driving her actions, but a calculated thirst for something more. She had grown weary of being the dutiful wife, living in Thomas's shadow. George, with his influence and wealth, became her means to an end. Everything took a dark turn on March 6, 2014, when the police were called to the Peterson residence. Thomas's body was found in the greenhouse, his head brutally struck with a heavy object. What had once been a peaceful retreat where Thomas indulged his love for plants had turned into a crime scene. Blood splattered across the floor, leaving the community reeling in shock. Looking back at early 2012, when their meetings became more frequent and their conversations darker, George, consumed with guilt, often spoke of ending the relationship, citing fear of the consequences. But Emily always convinced him otherwise, using her emotional grip to keep him close. She reminded him of how lonely they both were, how Thomas's neglect of her was unjust, and how they deserved happiness, even if it came at a price. By this point, George was too entrenched in the affair to break free. Emily's manipulation grew more cunning as time passed. She subtly began planting the idea that Thomas's absence would not only be a relief but a necessity. She hinted at how much simpler life would be without Thomas's constant focus on the business, without him always being in the way. George, emotionally drained and fragile, started to agree. He began seeing Thomas not as his son but as an obstacle to the life he and Emily could share. By mid-2013, Emily had gained complete control over George. He was willing to do anything to keep her in his life, even if it meant betraying his own family. But Emily was already looking ahead. She saw a chance to not only free herself from her marriage but also take over the family business. George was aging, and she knew it wouldn't be long before control of the flower shops passed to her. But first, Thomas had to go. As their affair deepened, so did Emily's schemes. By January 2014, she had begun carefully setting the stage for Thomas's demise. She was patient, calculating, and knew her moment was coming. What had started as a secret affair had turned into a dangerous game of manipulation, with George as her pawn and Thomas as her target. On March 2, 2014, everything began to unravel in the Peterson household. What had been quietly brewing for years behind closed doors finally reached its breaking point. Emily, always in control, decided it was time to act. She knew she could no longer uphold the charade of her life. Her affair with George had become more than just a secret. It was now a tangled web of lies and manipulation, threatening to come crashing down. George, weighed down with guilt, hesitated. The gravity of his actions overwhelmed him, and the thought of committing an even greater sin, the murder of his own son, paralyzed him with fear. But Emily was relentless. She had spent years mastering the art of manipulating George, exploiting his weaknesses. She knew exactly how to push George just enough to get what she wanted without scaring him off. Emily framed their situation in a way that allowed him to justify the unthinkable. George, torn between his feelings for Emily and the moral values he once held dear, felt trapped. He believed her when she said that Thomas's death was inevitable, that it was the only way for them to escape the lies. She convinced him it was necessary, a way to cleanse their lives and start fresh. Emily's plan was cold and calculated, like everything else she did. She had thought through every detail, aware that George's fragile emotional state made him easy to manipulate. The plan was simple but ruthless, leaving little trace. She gave George clear instructions, reassuring him that once it was done, they would finally be free. No more secrets, no more guilt. George, despite his inner turmoil, let his emotions cloud his judgment. He was too far gone, too deeply in love with Emily to turn back now. 4 days later, on the night of March 6, 2014, the plan reached its violent conclusion. The Peterson household, usually quiet and peaceful, became the site of a horrific crime. Thomas's lifeless body was discovered in the greenhouse, his head shattered by a heavy object. Blood pooled around him, staining the floor where he had once tenderly cared for his plants. The greenhouse, once a place where Thomas found peace in his work, was now marred by violence and death. The discovery of Thomas's body sent shockwaves through the community. News of the tragedy spread quickly, with neighbors gathering outside the Peterson home, confused and disturbed. The family was well known in the neighborhood, and Thomas's flower shops had long been a staple of the local economy. The idea that such a brutal crime could befall someone so respected was unimaginable. The police arrived quickly, led by Detective Martin Collins, a seasoned investigator with years of experience handling violent crimes. As he surveyed the scene, Collins immediately sensed something was amiss. There were no signs of forced entry and nothing seemed to be missing. The initial theory of a robbery gone wrong, which seemed plausible at first, quickly fell apart. This crime was personal. Its precision and brutality pointed to someone close to Thomas. By March 8, 2014, the investigation was in full swing. The police began interviewing everyone connected to Thomas, starting with Emily. She played the role of the grieving widow almost flawlessly, but to Detective Collins something seemed off. Emily appeared upset, but her tears seemed too controlled, her emotions too calculated. She calmly explained how Thomas had come home late the night before the murder and how she had gone to bed early, unaware of anything unusual. Despite her composed demeanor, Collins couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Emily's behavior after the murder was odd. In the days following the tragedy, she didn't appear genuinely grief-stricken. Her routine barely changed. While others in her position might have been overwhelmed by sorrow, Emily carried on as if nothing significant had occurred. Her lack of genuine emotion raised red flags for the detective. Something about her story just didn't add up. Then, on March 20, 2014, a breakthrough came when a hidden phone was found in Emily's closet. The discovery blew the investigation wide open. The phone contained explicit text messages between Emily and George, revealing the full scope of their affair. The texts were detailed, discussing their plans to get rid of Thomas and even hinting at the exact day they would do it. George appeared hesitant in the messages, but it was clear that Emily had orchestrated everything, pushing him toward committing the unthinkable. With this new evidence, Detective Collins knew the investigation had reached a critical turning point. George's involvement was undeniable, and the truth was now just a matter of time. Emily, however, continued to deny everything, insisting the messages were nothing more than fantasy. She portrayed herself as the victim, claiming George had misunderstood their conversations. She painted George as a grieving man who had manipulated her, casting herself as an innocent woman caught in a tragic misunderstanding. But George's guilt was too great to conceal. After the evidence surfaced, he began to unravel. By April 1, 2014, George had completely withdrawn from his usual social circles and family gatherings. His once strong presence had crumbled, and he could barely look his grandchildren in the eyes. The weight of his actions consumed him. He no longer spoke about the future or offered advice. He was a shell of the man he once was, destroyed by his own guilt. When the police finally brought him in for questioning on April 1st, George's calm facade shattered. Confronted with the phone records, George broke down, confessing to the affair. He explained how Emily had drawn him in, using his grief and vulnerability to manipulate him. He admitted that he had fallen for her, but he strongly denied any involvement in Thomas's murder. George described how the affair had spiraled out of control, but he couldn't bring himself to confess to the ultimate crime. Emily, however, remained composed as George confessed. She stuck to her story, continuing to claim that the messages were simply part of a fantasy and denying any plot to harm Thomas. She placed all the blame on George, insisting he had acted out of desperation. But the overwhelming evidence, combined with George's broken confession, told a different story, one of a manipulative woman who had carefully orchestrated her husband's downfall. As the case moved forward, the community was left reeling from the betrayal, wondering how such darkness had been hidden beneath the surface of such a respected family. On April 15, 2014, the quiet streets of the London neighborhood buzzed with shock as both Emily and George were arrested for Thomas's murder. The news spread rapidly, reaching every corner of the community. This was no ordinary crime. It was a betrayal that cut deep, shaking the very foundation of the Peterson family. A family once admired for their success and respectability, Emily had always been seen as the devoted wife, while George had long been respected as a wise and strong figure. The revelation of their affair and involvement in Thomas's death left everyone in disbelief. The trial, which began in early 2015, became a spectacle, drawing crowds from across the city. The courthouse was packed every day with neighbors, colleagues, and even the local media eager to witness the downfall of a family that had once seemed perfect. Cameras captured every moment, and reporters painted Emily as a cold, calculating woman who had manipulated an old man into killing her husband. George, the once proud and respected elder of the community, appeared broken. He looked older than his 65 years, his shoulders slumped, and his face gaunt, as though the weight of his actions had drained the life out of him. Throughout the trial, George broke down multiple times, overwhelmed with guilt. He admitted to the affair, explaining how Emily had slowly gained control of him, drawing him deeper into her web of manipulation. He described how he had never intended for Thomas to die, insisting that his involvement had spiraled out of control under Emily's influence. His remorse was evident, and many in the courtroom felt sympathy for him, but his confession, although filled with regret, did little to absolve him of his role in the crime. Emily, in stark contrast, exuded confidence. She sat in the courtroom with a calm and composed demeanor, showing no signs of guilt like the kind that consumed George. Even as the gruesome details of the murder were laid out, she remained firm in her defense, claiming that George had acted on his own and that she had never intended for things to escalate so far. She maintained that their messages, which clearly outlined the plan to kill Thomas, were nothing more than a fantasy misunderstood by an old man who had become infatuated with her. To the jury and everyone watching, Emily's lack of remorse was chilling. Her cold detachment from the events made it clear that she was the mastermind behind the entire scheme. She had manipulated George from the start, exploiting his vulnerability and using his love for her as a tool to achieve her own ends. It became clear that Emily's motive was never love, but power. The power to control the Peterson family, take over the flower shop business, and rid herself of the marriage that had kept her trapped in a life of duty and routine. George, once a man of integrity, had been reduced to a pawn in her calculated plan, falling so deeply into sin that he could no longer find a way out. As the trial continued, the emotional toll on the Peterson family became increasingly visible. Lily, now 17, and Max, 13, were forced to endure the painful details of their father's murder while also grappling with their mother's betrayal. Lily, who had always admired her mother's strength, was left heartbroken, struggling to reconcile the woman who raised her with the cold manipulator described in court. Max, still so young, could barely comprehend how his entire world had collapsed. The loss of his father and the destruction of his family weighed heavily on him. Both children were left to navigate the shame and confusion that followed them everywhere they went. On October 10, 2015, the verdict was delivered. The jury, after hearing all the details of the case, found Emily guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, a decision that brought some closure to the community but left many unanswered questions. George, although spared from a life sentence, faced his own punishment. He was convicted of lesser charges, but his reputation was irreparably damaged, and his guilt would haunt him for the rest of his life. The social circles where he had once been respected no longer welcomed him, and his family ties were shattered beyond repair. In the aftermath of the trial, the Peterson family was left in ruins. The flower shop business, once a source of pride, struggled to survive. Without Thomas's leadership and with George's involvement in the scandal, many customers abandoned them, and the community's trust in the family was broken. Lily and Max were left to navigate life without the guidance of their parents, both of whom were lost to them in different ways. Lily, standing on the brink of adulthood, bore the family's shame on her shoulders. She tried to stay strong for Max, but the trauma of losing both parents, one to murder and the other to the justice system, took a heavy toll. She often reflected on the days before everything fell apart, wondering how her mother had managed to hide such darkness beneath their seemingly perfect life. Max, still so young, struggled to find his place in a world where both his parents had betrayed him. The emotional scars left by the trial would follow him and his sister for the rest of their lives. As the dust settled on the trial, the community remained divided. Some viewed George as a man who had been led astray, a victim of Emily's manipulation. Others believed that he too bore responsibility for the tragedy, unable to escape the consequences of his own actions. But the most lingering question was, what had truly driven Emily to orchestrate such a horrific act? Was it simply a desire for freedom, or was there something deeper, a hunger for power and control, buried beneath her facade of devotion and duty? The unraveling of Emily's affair and her cold manipulation of George left an indelible mark on the community. It served as a grim reminder that even the most outwardly perfect lives could hide unimaginable darkness. The betrayal, the murder, and the trial left the neighborhood grappling with the haunting truth that appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes those we trust the most are the ones capable of causing the greatest harm.